Hello, podcast listeners. I am your host, Jacko Zwetslook. Today is Monday, October 10th, 2022. Welcome to the NK News podcast. And joining me via Zoom today are three members of the NK News and NK Pro team to discuss some of the recent stories out of and about North Korea. But please, before we begin, I'd like to remind all of you, leave a review about this podcast on iTunes or whatever platform you use. And please share this podcast with colleagues and friends and even enemies. And on Spotify, you can leave a rating but no reviews, but please do that anyway. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, you can please click like and subscribe. Second, check out nknews.org, where you can find all of the in-depth stories written by the excellent journalists that I'll be talking to today. Consider buying a subscription for a year. It's much more affordable than you think. In fact, if you sign up for the annual plan, that's less than $1 a day, and that helps to fund the excellent journalism that my colleagues put out each and every day. And third, you can follow all of us on Twitter. You can find each of our handles in the show notes, and nknews.org is the general one for the whole platform. Now, to introduce our three guests today, we have my colleagues Jewell, Ifang Bremer, and James Fretwell. Yes, it's an all-male roundtable, but not by design. We hope to return to a more gender-diverse roundtable next month. Welcome on the show this morning, men.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Becca. Good morning.
Okay, James, let's talk about missiles. There's been rather a lot of them. North Korea is once more launching objects into the sea, ballistic missiles, short-range missiles, etc. Give us the breakdown. What have they been launching and where from?
Oh, to give you the breakdown, I mean, how much time do we have, Jacko? There have been quite a few missile launches since the end of September, mostly short-range ballistic missiles, which put particularly South Korea in immediate danger. The really big news, the one that really captivated international headlines was, of course, the intermediate range ballistic missile on October the 4th that flew over Japan. That was the first time that a missile had flown over Japan in 5 years. So that was a really big deal. I just said it was an intermediate range ballistic missile. Yes, yeah. Obviously that really panicked a lot of people in Japan. The J alert system went off. I think this really, this really upped the ante, that missile test, and maybe North Korea is building up to something even bigger in the immediate future.
Let me ask a question about that missile that flew over Japan. How high did it fly? I mean, could Japanese people see it from the ground with the naked eye? Was Japan in any real actual danger?
Well, so the missile flew higher than the International Space Station. That's an interesting thing to point out. And it panics a lot of people in Japan, because when these missiles fly over Japan, the J alert warning system sends out warnings to everyone in the region over loudspeakers, on national TV, etc. And in a lot of these rural areas in Japan, a lot of houses are made of wood, actually, and so there are a few safe places to hide. Actually, possibly another very worrying thing. I mean, it's worrying to get a missile alert, of course, but it's perhaps even more worrying to have the missile be launched and then hear about the event afterwards. The J alert system failed in 6 areas in Japan, so obviously that's going to make people concerned. That is Japan. Is the government capable of protecting us?
Here's a technical question for you. If the missile flew higher than the International Space Station, that means it left the Earth's atmosphere. Am I correct?
I think, oh God, you put me on the spot there about technicality.
My very basic understanding of the International Space Station is it's in outer space, so therefore it must be outside the atmosphere, therefore the missile flew above that. Does that mean it's actually not in Japanese airspace if it's outside the atmosphere? Is this more, if that's the case, I'm just wondering, thinking aloud here, whether that's, whether Japan was in any real danger, or whether this is more a case of bad manners and North Korea flying a missile over a country without telling somebody first.
I mean, you could maybe argue that, I suppose, if you think about it, because of where North Korea is located in the world, if it is going to test missiles, which the international community prohibits. But anyway, let's brush aside that minor concern. I'm being sarcastic, obviously. Aside from that point, if North Korea is going to test a missile over a longer range, it has to go over somewhere. It's either going to go over South Korea, it's either going to go over China or Russia, which it's not going to do. So the other option is Japan.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how many missiles have been launched this year so far? What's the count? And what are the different types?
Oh God, I mean, we've had absolutely everything this year: short, medium, long range, failed missile tests. Remember?
Yeah.
I think including failed missile tests, I think it's around something like 20 to 25 missile events. That's how we're phrasing them. Missile events, because obviously in one launch you might launch 2, 4, 8 missiles, so something like 20 to 25 missile events. The biggest ones, I think, ones to really take note of from this year in particular, I think, was the March ICBM, which there was a little bit of confusion over that because North Korea reported this success of the Hwasong 17. It's really, monster, this huge road mobile liquid fueled missile. It's claimed that it's tested it successfully, but actually, I believe it was Collins Werko, our reporter at NK News, that pointed out that maybe that test actually failed and that North Korea was trying to cover that up for propaganda purposes. But anyway, I mean, every test provides North Korea with valuable data that it can then go on to improve its missiles in the future. The other really important one was in April, and that was a short-range tactical missile. Yeah. And a lot of experts are saying that perhaps this nuclear test that North Korea appears to be preparing for might be for a smaller nuclear warhead, a more compact nuclear warhead to put on this missile. Right. And if North Korea can master this technology to get tactical missiles, then it has the capability, supposedly, to hit the continental United States with either its, Hwasong 15 or 17 ICBMs, and then also fire shorter range tactical nuclear warheads at South Korea as well.
Now, North Korea, of course, when it has these missile events, it launches them from different sites located around the country. They're not all from the same place. Roughly how many missile sites have been active this year?
I mean, that's another really great question. I don't have the exact number, but it is important to note that they've been firing them, from the west of the country, from the east of the country, absolutely everywhere. And this is important because if the US, South Korea, and Japan decide to, take out some of these missile sites, well, if there's only a few, then they're easier to take out, right? If North Korea can fire them from all around the country, then that gives it stronger deterrence, basically. It's saying that even if you take out 1, 2, 3, 4, however many of our missile sites, are you sure that you're going to get them all? Maybe not. And, we're going to prove that we can fire these missiles from all around the country. There was a really interesting test, I think, in June where North Korea fired 8 missiles from 4 different launch sites across the country, and that was all, we consider that one missile event. But again, it's just showing that, the Kim Jong Un is saying, if we wanted to, we could fire off all these missiles from different sites around the country, and ball's in your court.
Let's bring in Ifang. Ifang, I believe that there's some photographs that have been released in the last 24 hours of the most recent launch event. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this morning we finally got to see pictures of these recent launch events, because you know we've seen all these missiles going up in the air. I mean, we know about them, we haven't actually seen them, right? Last week, which made us all curious. Is there no domestic propaganda purpose at all going on? Well, apparently there is, because this morning in the Northern Shimun, finally we got to see Kim Jong Un overseeing all these tests the past week. So
So
yeah,
he was
this is
physically
still,
present at the launches, was he?
yeah, it seems so.
Hmm.
At least for several of the launches, he was physically present. And now that we have the images of these launches, experts can analyze them and see, which missiles actually went up in the air. So yeah,
Right.
that will be, I guess, for today or later this week. Yeah, so that's interesting.
I'd
Okay.
also add on to that. So, I mean, of course, it's really great for the analysts whenever North Korea publishes pictures of these missiles, because you do get to have a closer look, at the more technical details and really understand why a particular missile is uniquely threatening, as opposed to, of course, it's a missile. All missiles are threats. But the other thing to note is that, North Korea kind of over the last year or so, it's done a lot of missile tests, but it didn't always publicize them. And that kind of gave rise to people thinking that, oh, perhaps there's, North Korea isn't trying to send a message to the world as such. It's more trying to make these tests a regular thing, instead of building them up as this huge event. If it tests missiles without publicizing them, then it's kind of saying, well, if South Korea and the US is going to test and develop missiles, kind of casually, then we're also going to do that as well. When North Korea puts them in state media, it's obviously you can't look into the mind of Kim Jong Un and tell perhaps exactly what kind of messaging he's trying to send. But the message the outside world is going to receive is quite clear. International media is going to republish all of these photos,
Yeah.
and it's going to cause alarm about what's happening on the Korean Peninsula.
Okay. So in the last week, how many missile events have we had in the last week?
Oh, goodness me.
Okay. Well, since the
Last
beginning of
week,
October, then in the last 10 days.
I think 3 or 4, I think, since October.
Because that does feel like it's hard to say that by bunching them up together like North Korea has done, that it's not trying to do this for some outside messaging purposes.
Look, there are lots of reasons why North Korea could be testing missiles. Obviously, the main reason that you would test and develop a missile is to have an effective weapon. That's
Yeah.
the ultimate objective. But after that, does North Korea publicize it? Does it not publicize it? You know, Always bearing in mind that the tests are primarily to improve its weapons capabilities.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also important to consider how North Korea is portraying these launches to its domestic audience and also to the outside world as well.
Okay. How are South Korea, Japan, and the United States responding?
So, since Yoon Suk-yeol, the South Korean president, came to power, he's come out with these initiatives to achieve North Korean denuclearization, I suppose, right? We had the audacious plan, which was basically South Korea will put in economic investment if North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons. South Korea is also, saying it's going to be much tougher than the Moon Jae-in, the previous administration, was on sanctions and all of this stuff. And we can see that with the recent missile launches. I think another part of South Korea's policy towards North Korea, Yoon's policy toward North Korea, is really strengthening the alliance with the US and also bolstering military cooperation with Japan. You've had a lot of meetings and military drills that haven't happened for 5 years, actually, in a lot of cases, in response to these North Korean missile launches. I think this sends a powerful message that, North Korea, you're not going to, no matter how much you improve your weapons capabilities, here's what we've got. So we've got an alliance with the world's military superpower.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, if you try something, it's not going to work out well for you. So I think that we'll see a lot more of this, improving South Korea's military capabilities, and strengthening its ties with the US and Japan going forward.
And with Japan, that's interesting. We've got to keep an eye on that. We'll have to leave it there for now. Ifang, let's talk to you about a story that you published on October 7th. Oh, hang on, wait, before we go on, I just, speaking of dates, I'm reminded that today being October 10th, this is the Workers' Party of Korea Foundation Day, the ruling party of North Korea, the KWP. Could we be expecting to see some kind of spectacular event today? Anyone could feel free to jump in here. Ethan, Ifang, James, who's got some ideas about what we may be expecting in the media today?
It's a tough one. In 2020, there was, of course, a huge military parade. North Korea normally does big military parades to mark 5- and 10-year anniversaries. So that was why that particular celebration for the founding anniversary of the Workers' Party of Korea, that's why that was such a big deal. But actually last year as well, you didn't get a military parade, but you did kind of get the next best thing, which was this huge weapons expo. And that provided analysts with a lot of extra images of a good chunk of North Korea's weapons arsenal. So, who knows? Maybe we'll get something related to that.
Right. It was founded, of course, on October the 10th, 1945, just a little bit less than 2 months after the defeat of Japan in World War II. So yes, 2020 would have been a big year, but 2022 probably not such a big one. So maybe nothing will happen. We'll see. We'll find out in due course. All right, Ifang, let's turn to you now and talk about a story that you published 3 days ago, titled "Seoul NGO Suspected of Illegally Importing North Korean Art Under Investigation." So which non-governmental organization is suspected of illegally importing North Korean art?
Yeah, so this NGO is called the Asia Pacific Exchange Association. It's based in Seoul, and its usual activities are returning the remains of victims of colonial forced labor from Japan. So that's not necessarily North Korea related, but the NGO's director also has a strong interest in inter-Korean cooperation projects, it seems.
Right. Now that's the name again. There is the Asia Pacific. I think it's the acronym is APIA. So maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure why.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. All right. And so that they're normally bringing home Korean remains, for example, Koreans who were mobilized during World War II to fight on Japan-controlled islands or territories, to bring back those bodies to South Korea. That's their stated sort of main objective. Is that right?
That's right. But in 2018 and 2019, this NGO also co-organized inter-Korean peace events together with Gyeonggi province, the most populous province here in South Korea. Yeah, so it definitely has a range of activities that it focuses on.
Yeah. Okay, and why is it illegal to import North Korean art?
Well, there's this thing called the Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation Act, which prohibits importing North Korean materials without approval of the South Korea's Ministry of Unification first, because buying things from North Korea is often covered by sanctions, international sanctions, domestic sanctions. So you cannot just buy a North Korean painting when you're in South Korea. You really need to go through a very rigorous administrative process before you can actually get a painting here.
Yeah. And these paintings, are these the kinds of North Korean propaganda paintings that we often see in the media, smashing the US White House, or killing American soldiers, or standing up for communism? Is that the kind of paintings we're talking about?
No, definitely not, because these paintings were actually displayed at these inter-Korean events. We're talking about dozens of paintings.
Yeah.
So then obviously you will not expect those kind of things, but more like the natural beauty of the Korean Peninsula, those kind of things, a kind of more neutral topics that still can serve some kind of propaganda purpose, because as some analysts say, all art in North Korea is essentially political, but not all
Kim Jong
art
Un
is.
said that too, by the way. There's no art
Right,
for
there you
art's
go.
sake in the DPRK.
Yeah. So, but definitely not you won't see airplanes bombing
Right.
the US or something on these paintings. But what's interesting is that these paintings, after these events, they just disappeared. The Ministry of Unification only approved the import of 3 paintings. But now, 2 years later, after these paintings were last seen, South Korean broadcaster JTBC.
Yep,
It's
JTBC. That's one of the
JTBC.
cable news channel.
That's right. They saw some suspicious activity near the office of this NGO, and they saw what looked like paintings being put in the back of a car.
Right.
And that's how basically these paintings suddenly reappeared. Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like APIA hasn't been selling them; it's just been storing them.
Right. Yeah, it seems like it. And this might be related to the NGO's director's plan, which he had in 2018. He wanted to set up a blockchain-based North Korean art auction system.
Wow.
But it doesn't seem his efforts have been successful. Obviously, after 2018, after 2019, relationships between North and South have not become better. So it seems that his efforts stalled.
Have these paintings now been confiscated by the South Korean government?
From my understanding, they have not. So basically, the police stopped a car with the director present, and they saw a couple of the paintings in the back of the car. They didn't confiscate them just yet, but they started an investigation, which they now transferred to the South Korea Customs Agency.
Right. Because
so surely
the allegation of illegally bringing things in from North Korea, so it's going to be handled by the customs police.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And I understand that somehow there's an allegation of bribery involving a high-level politician, in fact, a former deputy governor of Gyeonggi province. What's going on there?
Well, to make things more complicated, this NGO shares its offices with the Sangbangul Group, a South Korean conglomerate, currently making headlines for alleged stock price manipulation involving business dealings with North Korea back in 2019. Yeah, it's getting complicated, but corporate records show that the NGO's director was appointed CEO of a subsidiary of this group when this conglomerate allegedly started bribing a high-ranking Gyeonggi official to broker a business deal with North Korea. So there seems to be a bigger story going on the back.
Do you know any more about the brokering of a business deal with North Korea? Is this the blockchain art auction that you were talking about, or is that something else?
No, it's not. So according to South Korean media reports, South Korean prosecutors are now investigating that Lee Hwa-young, who was the deputy governor of Gyeonggi province, received hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of bribes from this South Korean conglomerate in the form of corporate credit card spendings, use of luxury vehicles. And in exchange, Lee allegedly helped to arrange a business deal with North Korean organizations for the exclusive trading rights to rare earth materials.
Rare earths, okay.
Yeah. And after that, stock price soared of this particular South Korean company. But I think what this really shows is, how far we are from that era, 2018, 2019, when people had all these wild plans of, setting up, business opportunities with North Korea. And now, it's all obviously fallen apart, and people are actually being prosecuted for the things they've done during those years.
Did you try to interview the head of the APIA? He sounds like an interesting character.
Yeah, we obviously tried to reach out to give them a chance to respond, but yeah, no one was available for comment, unfortunately.
Okay, well, we do hope that they come out and tell their story at some point. Thanks very much, Ifang. Ethan, moving on to you. Rather than staring off into space, you've been staring back from space, specifically looking back down at North Korean crops, and at NK Pro, that's the premium product of NK News. You have a story about crop health in North Korea. What have you seen?
Yeah, Jacko. So what we've seen essentially is that the health or the median health of North Korean crops over the past few years has not really improved. And in fact, it's actually declined slightly. So when we say the health of crops has declined, what I'm referring to is this index called EVI, or Enhanced Vegetation Index.
Okay.
And it's sort of a like technical term, but basically what it is if you take satellite imagery, optical satellite imagery, like you'll see from our colleague Colin Zwerko all the time, and you essentially run some computations on the data that make up those images, and it can actually reveal information that is not as apparent. So for instance, you can run some calculations on optical satellite imagery and come out with a value that shows essentially it's a proxy of how much light is being reflected by healthy vegetation. And so the idea is that the greener a plant is, the healthier it is.
Yeah.
And this particular practice or method has been used for quite some time now, ever since satellite imagery became widely available, not just for studying countries at large, but even for studying crop health at a smaller scale. So it's actually not uncommon for farmers to use this particular index to measure the health of their own crops and plot that over time. So I essentially repeated this same process for North Korea, using some satellite imagery from the Terra Modis satellite, which is run by NASA.
Yep.
And yeah, we came out with some set of measurements, which you can see at NK Pro.
Yes, that's right. Our NK Pro subscribers can look at the actual maps that you've prepared there, and some graphs as well to accompany the story. What is land cover mask? Because I was a bit confused by that term there.
Sure. So the main problem with this type of data is whenever the satellite makes measurements of the entire Earth's surface, it doesn't just measure portions of the Earth's surface that are filled with crops.
Right.
So in other words, if we were to just scan all of North Korea and then calculate the enhanced vegetation index for the entire country, it would be skewed by, say, forests, just plains and other things that are not actually representative of, you know, human agriculture. So to solve this, some people much smarter than I came up with this thing called a land cover mask, which is essentially a very complicated algorithm that can look at the entire Earth's surface and say, okay, this pixel right here, this we're going to consider croplands. Okay. This one right here, this is water, and this right here, this is, you know, desert. So this type of mask is generated, well, it's called a mask because what we can do is essentially apply it to the unfiltered image of North Korea and mask away everything that is not croplands. So when we say land cover mask, what we're essentially saying is filter out everything that's not crops. Right. Now let's take the measurement of EVI, and the hope is that this gives us a more accurate measurement of what's actually happening.
Now, how is that crop health changing over time? Is it remaining stable? Is it going backwards in North Korea?
Well, if you check out the charts that we have over on NK Pro, you can see essentially what you would expect, which is that as the growing season goes on, particularly around May, June, and July, you'll see a rapid increase in what we consider to be healthy levels of EVI. And so you'll see that these have a very clear seasonal pattern to them. That being said, that doesn't really tell us a whole lot. So instead, what we can do is plot a distribution of the particular EVI values over time, over several years, and say, okay, in 2019, the median or the most occurring, the value that occurs the most for crop health is X, and then in the next year it's say 0.5% or 1% lower. And so if we track it that way, we can actually get a better idea of the general trend of crop health over time. And the reason that that's important is because EVI might be a good tool for studying general crop health, but the particular varieties of, say, corn, rice, and barley that are grown in North Korea do not necessarily reflect light in the exact same way as those grown, say, in the United States or India or China. So it's important that we look at the longer overall trends to actually get a better idea of what's going on.
That's very interesting. How far back does the data go for North Korea?
I believe for this particular data set, it goes back to 2002. For the NK Pro article, we only went back to 2019 just to not overload the reader. That being, and the other issue is that there's actually a technical limitation here, which is that this data takes up a lot of space, and the program we put together to process it actually takes quite a bit of time just to go through it. So yeah, we only have a few years back, but it can certainly be used to look at even larger, more historical trends.
Wow, that's a great resource for researchers looking at agriculture. Just more broadly, Ethan, why is food security such an issue in North Korea?
Right. Well, this has been an issue in the country for several decades at this point. Speaking with a few experts for that story, the main reasons that come up are one, incentives, which is just that there's just not a lot of incentives for farmers to produce bumper crops, because if a certain portion of your harvest is going to be seized by the state and put into public distribution systems that have been broken down for decades now, and you can't sell your surplus legally, at least on the open market, then there's just very little reason to put in the extra time, put in the extra work and investment to produce excess harvests. Another reason would be poor land and water management. We've seen this be a problem in the North for quite some time. Agricultural practices have not exactly been as scientific as in other places. And so you might not have proper crop rotations to make sure that the soil remains in good health, et cetera. And there's a whole bunch of other reasons as well. Every year around the harvest, we hear stories about theft, even not just of other people's crops, but essentially theft from the state, which is farmers will take a portion of their harvest and attempt to hide it from authorities, so that they can make a profit on the open market. And so there's many ways that food security has become such an issue there.
And looking at the entire country, are there areas that are more affected than others by these problems?
Well, the main areas that are going to be affected by these problems is going to be the areas that are the breadbaskets anyway. So that would be the 4 coastal provinces on the west, because these produce almost 100% of the country's food crops. So if you go more out to the east, it's very mountainous country, very cold. Soil's not very suitable for farming. And so you're going to have most of these issues on the west coast, essentially.
Right. Gosh. Now, is North Korea, I mean, it sounds like a basic question, but North Korea is not self-sufficient in terms of food, is it?
No. And I mean, this is apparent if you just look at, say, trade data. I mean, every year we've seen this data is publicly available since 2017, but you'll see several $1 million worth of different foodstuffs going into the North from China. That has decreased recently because of COVID-19 border restrictions. But North Korea is not food self-sufficient in much the same way that many countries, even in the West, are not food self-sufficient, just because they may not necessarily, it might not make economic sense to contribute, to basically put in all of the capital. You might have a competitive advantage in, say, producing semiconductors as South Korea does, or Taiwan does, then it makes sense to grow a large number of crops. So no, North Korea is not definitely not food self-sufficient, and this is clear also from the fact that basically every year for as many years as I can remember, the World Food Program and other aid organizations have basically sounded the alarm that much of the population is malnourished.
In the best of all possible worlds, could North Korea ever hope to be food self-sufficient with an ideal harvest and climate conditions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see a reason why not necessarily. There's plenty of croplands along the west. I mean, I'm not a farmer myself, but the country does put a lot of emphasis on scientific farming methods and improving agricultural practices, and that's all great. But it's going to take larger stores of fertilizer, a little bit less control, not a little bit less control, much less control from the state to allow farmers, to incentivize farmers to actually produce more. And if all that goes well, I think it is possible that the country could become even closer to food self-sufficient, or at least have enough to properly feed its population.
Okay, well, that's important. Yeah. So, Ethan, does that mean that under the current international sanctions, that North Korea could only hope to have enough food to feed its population by receiving food aid from international donors, given that it really can't buy much at the moment?
Well, sanctions against the country do not prohibit it from importing food. So that's not necessarily the problem here. I think most of it just has to do with, again, the lack of incentives for farmers to produce excess harvests. So there's not as big of a problem there with, say, UN sanctions are inhibiting the North's ability to import food. A lot of it is unfortunately just mismanagement by the state rather than outside influences. Now, that being said, there is a case to be made for the country having natural disasters that actually wipe out a certain percentage of its harvests, and that's not really anyone's fault in particular per se. So it's not uncommon it hasn't been uncommon in the past for floods to wipe out large portions of croplands. And I believe that that's one of the main reasons that the famine happened in the 90s, is because of some major flooding. So I don't think that sanctions are really impacting the quantity of food in the country. I think that it's mostly a fault of the leadership, unfortunately.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Ethan. That's an important story, and certainly one that will be studied every year, every time there's a harvest. James, moving back to you, since we last spoke, there's been the big annual meeting at the United Nations General Assembly. US President Biden gave a speech in which he mentioned North Korea briefly, and South Korean President Yoon also made a speech but did not mention North Korea. What was said about North Korea at the General Assembly?
Yeah, as you said, not much, which is really shocking when you consider that when Trump was president, we had all that Rocket Man stuff. Moon Jae-in last year, he was pushing his end of war declaration with North Korea, and then this year, not it's kind of fallen off the radar to some extent. Of course, there are huge things going on in the world right now outside of the Korean Peninsula, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example. But that doesn't mean North Korea is staying quiet. In fact, as we said earlier, it's conducting a lot of missile launches. It's really improving its missile capabilities. It's probably even more of a threat to countries in the region than ever before.
Gosh, did the ambassador from North Korea himself also give a speech at the United Nations General Assembly?
He did indeed. And of course, that was mainly focused on things to do with the US and South Korea. I think the interesting thing that he touched on was about North Korea's new nuclear law that was adopted at the beginning of last month. And I'm sure listeners have heard all about that. And it kind of expands the number of circumstances in which North Korea will use nuclear weapons. And the North Korean ambassador kind of said that this is our sovereign decision. You don't have a right to dispute this, and also we're not interested in dealing with South Korea.
Okay, still not interested in talking. While in New York for the big meeting there, President Yoon Suk-yeol met briefly with President Joe Biden and also with Japanese Prime Minister Kishida. What did he talk about with them?
I think more than the content of what they talked about, there was the meetings themselves, how they took place. I think that's of more interest. They did discuss North Korea, apparently, but Yoon and Biden, it appeared that South Korea really built up that there was going to be this big meeting with the US president, and it didn't happen. And I think that was quite embarrassing for Seoul. They kind of met briefly on a few occasions during their trip to London for the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. They had a 48-second meeting in New York. That was a very specific length, right? Just a brief interaction. That was with Biden. So not really much interaction between the US and the South Korean presidents, more of a longer meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida. And that was more important because South Korea-Japan relations have really suffered over the last few years. And the Yoon administration has really made this big effort to reach out to Japan to improve relations. And that's good news for Washington because it wants its allies that have these deep-rooted historical disputes between each other. They want them to kind of overcome that and work together to cooperate on issues like China and North Korea.
Now, about a week later, the US Vice President Kamala Harris visited South Korea and made a customary trip to the demilitarized zone and the joint security area. What did she see and what happened?
Harris went to the demilitarized zone. Around that time, there were also military exercises, naval military exercises with the US. That was the first. Those were the first exercises. Joint exercises involving an American aircraft carrier since 2017 around the Korean Peninsula. So, when top US officials go to the DMZ, it is quite symbolic. Again, it's showing that the alliance is strong and that we're not going to abandon South Korea in the face of all these North Korean missile launches.
Right, and that's was that in the talks with between Vice President Harris and President Yoon? Is that what they talked about largely?
There were lots of things they talked about, other issues as well, like the Inflation Reduction Act and all of that stuff. But they discussed North Korea briefly. Touched on the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Apparently, this was definitely a longer meeting than the smattering of interactions that Yoon and Biden had over a few days in London and New York. It also marks a big difference between when Nancy Pelosi, US House Speaker, visited recently, and South Korea kind of appeared to ignore Pelosi. So at least this time there was a face-to-face meeting between Yoon and the visiting top US official.
Indeed. Okay, thank you, James. Moving on to a story that both Ifang and Ethan have written together, but Ifang, you're the one who has flagged it for discussion, so I'll ask you. Anyone who has watched the news in the last week or two will be aware that Vladimir Putin moved to formally annex 4 regions in southern and eastern Ukraine to Russia. And now many Koreans, I think, would look upon this and see parallels of 1910 in Korean history, when Japan annexed all of the Korean peninsula to itself, making it the colony of Chosen. North Korea, which condemns those Korean individuals who 112 years ago facilitated and went along with Japan's annexation of Korea, has surprised some by supporting this particular annexation. How did it show its support, Ifang?
Well, it's been showing its support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine for months now, but notably recently, Foreign Ministry of North Korea released a statement saying that we will respect the will of the residents who aspired toward the integration into Russia, and they're referring to the residents of those breakaway regions, and support Russian government's statement of making the regions the composition of Russia. So this is per the Foreign Ministry of North Korea.
Right, yeah. And it's legitimizing the referendums that Russia ran in these occupied zones that has largely been called illegitimate by most of the world.
That's right. And already some months ago, North Korea was one of the very few countries in the world to actually recognize these breakaway regions, Luhansk and Donetsk.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is just a follow-up of that.
Right. Okay. So is this support likely to mean a lot to Russia at this time?
Well, I think at this point for Russia, any support is welcome. I think we should definitely see it in that light. Yeah.
I really wonder why North Korea is doing this. Again, I mentioned the historical context there. Is it here because North Korea is actually supporting, on principle, a stronger, larger country annexing a smaller, weaker one? Or is it something a bit more opportunistic? Does North Korea see something to be gained by doing this?
I think it's definitely the latter, right? Like this is purely opportunistic from what it seems. We saw Pyongyang's ambassador to Moscow, Shin Hong-chol, in August, saying there's great potential in the trade and economic direction in the field of labor migration. And he said that in regards to recognizing these two breakaway regions, Luhansk and Donetsk.
Yeah, right. Okay, so what could we see resulting from this support in the short, medium, and long term? Is it simply just North Korean builders moving over and rebuilding these broken areas?
I'm not quite sure. I think that really depends on the course of the war. Maybe if we can see some kind of, some people are saying that in the winter, the war will kind of take a pause, and maybe at that time North Korea will feel more confident sending some of the workers who are still in Russia to those regions. But so far we haven't seen any North Koreans deployed in those areas yet.
Now, I've heard some loose talk outside of NK News that we might actually see some North Korean soldiers or military supplies being put on the front lines in this war to shore up Putin's failing army. Have you seen any signs or heard any talk about that at this stage?
Well, we haven't seen any North Koreans fight in Ukraine. We also haven't seen North Korean weapons deployed in Ukraine, although researchers connected to the intelligence communities say that North Korea has already supplied Russia with at least, conventional artillery shells. We're not talking about advanced weapon system. We're talking about mortar shells, that kind of stuff. But so far, I have not seen on the ground reports of people, finding North Korean materials in Ukraine. So I'm not sure if it actually happened yet. Reports are very conflicting when it comes to this. North Korea actually has denied sending weapons to Ukraine. So I'm not really sure what is going on, but within the intelligence community, especially US and UK intelligence, they seem to be quite confident that North Korea is at least in the process of selling these to Russia.
Gosh. Ethan, have you got any details to add or any comment to make on this story?
No, I think I'll just leave this one to Ifang. He's been doing most of the coverage on Russia.
Okay. All right. Then, Ethan, we'll turn to you to talk about a story that you've written about U.S. government bureaucracy and trying to find out what happened to an American Air Force pilot who was lost, presumed shot down during the Korean War. Could you sketch out the details for us?
Sure. So this story has essentially been in the making for about 50 years now. And in short, there was a Korean War pilot, an American named Harry Cecil Moore, and he had been declared dead 3 times by the U.S. government. Once in 1944, when he was shot down over Kunming, China during World War II. He survived in the mountainside for something like 2 months, just sort of roughing it in the forest, eventually taken in by Chinese forces, who then returned him to the Americans. And on the same day that he returned to U.S. forces, the government had just sent a telegram to his wife saying that he was presumed dead. He then got home or he got back to base and sent a telegram saying, "No, actually, I'm fine."
Reports of my death have been much exaggerated.
Right, exactly. So that was only the first time. The second time was at the early stages of the Korean War. He re-enlisted to fight in that conflict, and the Air Force sort of inexplicably sent a telegram again to his wife saying that he had died, and it was purely erroneous. There was really no explanation for it. And they had to issue a correction almost immediately and say, "Oh, wait, sorry, that previous telegram was a mistake. He hasn't even actually flown today." So not really sure what happened there. And then in, I think, 1954, during the Korean War, he was actually
54 is technically after the armistice.
Or sorry, well, I'm going to have to leave out the date then, but it was a few years after the first time the second time he was presumed dead.
Right.
He actually was shot down near present-day Dandong, China, in a region called Mig Alley, which was named after the Soviet fighter jets that were known for patrolling that area. And this time, he had a very soft landing in the Yellow Sea, just about 100 meters off the coast. And he was presumed dead, and that was sort of the end of it. But 50 years later, his wife was still alive, and she had actually married Harry's brother named Robert in the meantime. And I believe in 2002, they received a letter from the US government saying that new information had come to light, and he might have actually survived that downing the third time. And what essentially followed was the government not being able to get its story straight.
Right.
They first said that there was reason to believe he had survived. Then records were found in Soviet archives that showed that several Soviet pilots and colonels had actually interviewed someone with the same name around the exact same time who was captured after engaging MiGs in the area.
So the Soviets may have had him.
Yes, the Soviets essentially said, we had someone with the exact same name who was transferred to an Air Force academy in Moscow, or at least near Moscow, I believe. And basically what happened to him after that is a mystery. And so the family of Harry Moore is still fighting the US government to this day to basically declassify a range of documents that the CIA has about what happened to Harry Moore.
So the CIA knows something, but it's still classified.
Yes, and the tricky part is that the CIA has essentially told the family that the information about Harry Moore is still being used. It's still operational, which is a surprise. Is a surprise to everyone because he was presumably shot down 70 years ago at this point. And so how in the world could the information still be in operation? And so the family of Harry Moore has claimed that they found 2 whistleblowers within the CIA who say that, no, this information is not operational. And so they're actually suing the federal government to release that information.
So it sounds a little bit like a bureaucratic snafu. We're talking about, apart from the CIA, there's this organization, this government office you mentioned in your report that when they received the Moore family received the letter in the early 2000s was called the Defense Prisoner of War / Missing Personnel Office, the DPMO, and then before that it had another name of the Joint POW / MIA Accounting Command, and then later on it morphed into the Defense POW / MIA Accounting Agency. It's hard to keep track of all these names. It almost sounds like it's hard for the people in that organization to keep track of their own paperwork.
Right. And that's a big part of this story too. And just for the sake of simplicity, as you mentioned, it has many names. So I'm just going to call it, the DPAA, which is its current name.
Okay.
But the reason it had so many name changes is because in the early 2000s, I believe, reports started to surface that this organization was deeply inept and in some cases actually corrupt.
Yeah.
So the purpose of the organization is to, of course, locate the remains of Americans who died overseas in foreign conflicts. But what was happening was the organization was sending teams of archaeologists or scientists and military officers on these essentially boondoggles and taxpayer-funded vacations in lush European destinations, not exactly the mountains of North Korea per se.
Yeah.
And so reports came out, an internal audit was conducted by the organization, and it actually admitted to itself, at least internally, that it was so inept that it was essentially dysfunctional, was the exact wording that the report used. Now, when that report was leaked to the media, the higher ups at the organization or at the bureau essentially tried to kill it, tried to downplay the rumors, call them controversial, etc. And so this organization has really struggled. And that sort of continues to this day, because even though it's been renamed multiple times, from what I understand and from what reports suggest, the personnel at the organization have essentially not changed. And it received, I believe, over $100 million per year to conduct its work. Now, at the same time, you have private individuals and organizations that are able to track down dozens of remains per year for a fraction of that, while this government organization is blowing tons of taxpayer money to essentially do very, very little.
Now, going back to the origins of the story, the Soviet Union didn't admit to being involved in the Korean War, although we later know that Soviet pilots were actually flying in North Korean uniforms, pretending to be North Korean pilots. What have we learned from Soviet archives about American POWs from the Korean War?
Right. So Harry Cecil Moore is just one of the many Americans who are now believed that they actually wound up in one way or another in the Soviet Union after fighting in the Korean War. So whenever the Soviet Union collapsed, and the new government came in and decided to essentially share old Soviet archives with the US government, a joint task force of Russian and American researchers essentially went through all of the archives and found there was credible evidence that several Americans, I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, that had more than likely been transferred to the Soviet Union. There were interviews conducted with Soviet pilots and military officials from the time that corroborated those records as well. And so it's sort of turned into a question of how many Americans were actually taken to the Soviet Union, and why is it that the US government has been so reluctant in some cases to admit to this, even though the Soviets themselves actually have admitted to it. So yeah, that sort of remains an open question.
And now I understand that there's a documentary coming out about specifically this man, Harry Cecil Moore. Could you tell us very briefly about that, please?
Sure. Sorry, real quick. Ifang, did you have something to add?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so the documentary that you mentioned, it actually came out several years ago, but it was funded by the family, Robert and Lois. And Robert is still alive. He's now 96 years old. His wife passed away a few years ago, but he told me that they funded their lawsuit against the government by themselves independently, as well as this documentary. And I believe about half of the documentary is available on YouTube for free. And yeah, they essentially documented everything that I've said here, minus some of the more recent developments that happened earlier this year.
Does the family have any hope at all of learning the details of what happened to their lost brother or husband?
Well, I mean, as you know, it's a lawsuit against federal agencies, so it could many years before they even reply or make any substantial progress there. But Robert himself is not necessarily super optimistic that he'll get to see the end of this case. But that being said, from what I understand, his his daughter and his granddaughter are very much interested in seeing this thing all the way through to the end.
Yeah.
And hopefully the family can find some peace of mind when that case finally concludes.
Okay, wow. Well, thank you very much for that, Ethan. James, back to you now. If mainland China were to move militarily on Taiwan tomorrow, and if the US were to decide to intervene to repel an invasion by Beijing, would US military assets in South Korea, for example, Air Force airplanes, automatically get involved? And if so, would they require South Korean consent to travel through Korean airspace to do so?
Well, it's interesting, Jacko, because the kind of crisis that was created when, when I shouldn't phrase it like that, perhaps, when Nancy Pelosi visited Asia, of course, China reacted quite strongly and conducted a lot of military exercises. And around that time, a US recon plane, a USFK, US Forces Korea recon plane, took off from the peninsula to the Taiwan Strait. So that does show that even though it's US Forces Korea, there is some kind of role for USFK in the region more broadly. South Korea is very, very, very sensitive to this, and it always maintains that if the USFK does want to have some kind of other role outside of the Korean Peninsula, then that should be established through close discussion with Seoul.
What's the current USFK commander said about the issue?
So, I mean, not too much, but he has said some things. So, for example, ahead of his confirmation in May 2021, Paul Lacomera, who is the commander of USFK, he said that, even though the alliance should remain focused on North Korea, he said that, that the alliance is always constantly evolving and we should be, flexible and adapt to threats that emerge in the region more broadly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the previous USFK commander as well, Robert Abrams, also was a big advocate of the allies addressing the threat from China when they make new operational war plans. So it seems like this thing that is happening behind the scenes more than in public, because it is such a sensitive issue for South Korea.
Yeah.
Of course, South Korea's main military partner is the US, but its main economic partner is China. And that kind of creates some difficult decisions for South Korea. It needs the US presence to balance against the threats from North Korea, but at the same time, China sees that as a potential threat against itself. And of course, we remember around 2017 when South Korea deployed the THAAD, the American missile defense system. China reacted really, really strongly to that because it didn't like how THAAD's radar could supposedly weaken China's own deterrent, and so therefore China did economically boycotted South Korea, did billions of dollars of damage to the economy. So fast forward back to today again, I think South Korea is cautious, very, very cautious about announcing some grand role for USFK in Taiwan because it doesn't want to anger China.
Yeah, that's certainly an issue where the public messaging needs to be very, very carefully crafted by all sides, but especially by South Korea. Thanks very much for that one, James. Now we've almost run out of time here. Ethan, I'm apologizing to you because I wanted to spend a bit more time on your third story about the space radar. I'm going to give you about a minute just to summarize what it is and why it's important, because it is a very interesting story over at NK Pro for our NK Pro subscribers. Go ahead, Ethan.
Sure. So long story short, the way that we've been tracking vessels for many years now is by looking at something called the Automatic Identification System. And that's essentially a set of radio transponders that most ships over a certain size are required to carry on board and broadcast their location essentially all the time. Now, the purpose of this system is to avoid collisions at sea, but it can also be used to track, say, North Korean vessels engaging in suspicious activities.
Yeah.
Now, while this isn't a problem to use AIS for pretty much every other country in the world, if you're a North Korean smuggler and you want to hide your location, the easiest thing to do is simply turn off your AIS transponder. And so we see this type of behavior quite a bit. And this has been the main shortcoming of using AIS. So the focus of this space radar story is essentially that there may be emerging a new way of tracking these vessels engaging in suspicious activity with something called synthetic aperture radar, which is essentially, instead of using optical light, so taking pictures from space or using AIS broadcasts, you can essentially beam radio waves down to the Earth's surface. And then once they reflect back to the satellite, that image can be essentially imaged in the same way that like a bat uses echolocation.
Yeah.
And the reason that this is more powerful than optical imagery is because the particular wavelengths used by these satellites and this imagery method can pierce through clouds. It also doesn't need to operate during the day. So obviously satellite images taken at night are pretty much useless if they're using optical light, but synthetic aperture radar, it's clear as day in a sense, day or night. It can even be used to peer underground or underneath dense canopies, etc. So it's a very powerful tool. Now, the main problem with it is that the resolution is very low. And so the data, when it's visualized for humans, is essentially unintelligible or very difficult to use. So I know I'm going over your time limit, Jocko, but I'll speed up here.
But go on.
So essentially, what has happened is that there's been advancements in machine learning in recent years. And an organization called Global Fishing Watch, which monitors illegal fishing around the world, hosted this competition where they asked machine learning engineers to design a model or machine learning model that can pick apart this very low resolution SAR, synthetic aperture radar data, and see basically pick out what is a ship and what is just water. And the better that these algorithms get, the faster they can detect ships. And they can do it at any time of the day, as long as the satellite has actually gone by overhead. And so the hope is that one day, instead of having to rely on AIS transmissions, we can essentially see every ship all the time with this application of artificial intelligence against this very unique type of satellite imagery.
And that's important in the North Korean context because of potential illegal sanctions busting, ship-to-ship transfers of oil and coal and things like that. That's why we're looking at this, isn't it, Ethan?
That's right. And good reason for hope is that the man who actually won the latest competition, he's a Ukrainian machine learning engineer. He told me that his algorithm is good enough to detect ship-to-ship transfers between fishing boats that are as small as 20 meters in length. Now, most ships conducting ship-to-ship transfers are much longer than 20 meters. They're usually around 80 to 100 meters. And so when I asked if this could be applied to, say, oil tankers, he said, yes, it could. And already there's code in place that can actually distinguish the type of vessel even though that the pixels are so blurry to our eyes, the machine learning algorithm is so good that it can even classify vessels in near real time. So the hope is that this is going to become a powerful new tool for sanctions monitors, such as the UN panel of experts.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for a good summary there. That's all we have time for today. Thanks to Ethan, Jewell, Ifang, Bremer, and James Fretwell for joining me on the podcast today. We'll talk to some of you again next month. Ladies and gentlemen, if you already have an NK News account, and if you're a think tank, business, or academic institution, check out NK Pro. Our NK Pro platform, we talked about 2 stories on there today with Ethan Jewell, offers unparalleled services specifically catered to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. You can inquire about access and a free trial membership by sending an email to membership@nknews.org today. Thanks as always go to Brian Betts and Arius Dare for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius, Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, etc. Thank you very much, and listen to us again next time.